Good evening, everybody. My name is Peter Wilton, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, and what a privilege that is. The Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation is the community foundation for Greater Melbourne and its region. I'm delighted, absolutely delighted, to welcome you to this important event, the inaugural Wilton Family Lecture for Inspiring Social Change. And I would like to start by acknowledging Paul Wilton and the Wilton family, who are all here tonight. Thank you. Now, this is National Reconciliation Week, so I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. The Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation recognises that we live, play and work on the lands of the world's oldest living culture, and acknowledge this privilege and responsibility with respect, humility and a willingness to listen and learn. We acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples as the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which our office is situated, this land here. And we acknowledge their continuing connections to culture, community, land and sea. And I'd like to extend that respect to any First Nations people who may be here today. So without further ado, I'm really excited about starting this, but I'd like to first welcome the Chair of the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation Board, Yanina Gawler, to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And good evening, everyone. I'm Yanina Gawler, the Chair of the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation. It's a real privilege to be here this evening to share with you this inaugural oration in recognition of the contribution made by Paul Wilton and Angela and their family to the discussion about social change. I too acknowledge the Woi-wurrung, Bunurong and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on the land where we're meeting. And in following up on Peter's comments, the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation is committed through reconciliation to continuing engagement with Indigenous people of this country. Thank you so much for joining us tonight on really important conversations of the need to change and to shift towards a wellbeing economy, one that places people and planet at the heart of our economic decisions. We're really proud to partner with Paul Wilton, AM KSJ, and to present the Wilton Family Lecture for Inspiring Positive Change. This lecture honours the commitment of Mr Wilton and Mrs Angela Wilton, OAM DSJ, and their family to Greater Melbourne, and their deep dedication to equity, opportunity and inclusion. This year's lecture focuses on economic justice and speaks directly to the challenges we face as a society and as a city. We're delighted to have Dr. Katherine Trebeck as our speaker. She's a globally recognised leader in rethinking what progress means. Her work has shaped government agendas, academic thinking and community aspiration. The wellbeing economy offers a new model, one that focuses on dignity, fairness and regeneration over growth for growth's sake. Katherine has co-founded the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, helped initiate the Wellbeing Economy Partnerships of Government, and she's a writer-at-large and co-director of the Compassion in Financial Services Hub at the University of Edinburgh and Economic Change Director at the Next Economy. She's also a member of the Club of Rome and co-founded the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Wheel in Scotland, which connects people and to bring networks for social justice and environmental health for all. Tonight's also something special for me personally. I first met Dr. Katherine Trebeck when she was a young researcher at the Australian National University Centre for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research at a time when I was working with Indigenous communities. It was evident then that her compassion and clarity of thought stood out. When I was later studying sustainability and economics, I was not surprised to find Katherine had been leading discussions globally on economics and wellbeing for some time, and again more recently we connected through the Foundation's work on the wellbeing economy as we shaped our new strategy. The Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation's new strategy 2030 aligns with Dr. Trebeck's vision, contributing to a society where social justice, economic equity and climate resilience guide our work. At its core, Strategy 2030 aims to ensure that communities shape the future of Greater Melbourne. We want a future that's fair, sustainable and one in which everyone can thrive. equally tonight, is about honouring the philanthropic spirit of Paul and Angela Wheelton. For over 2 decades, they've worked alongside the Foundation with intention and integrity. Their deep commitment to supporting women and girls, both here in Asia and the Pacific, reflects the kind of leadership that drives sustainable change. So it's with pride that we officially launched the Wilton Family Lecture Series, and many of the family members are here tonight to witness this, an initiative designed to inspire, provoke and reimagine how we create positive change. It's fitting that our inaugural keynote speaker is Dr. Katherine Trebeck. She will challenge us. And now it's my great pleasure to invite Paul to the stage to formally launch the lecture tonight. Would you please welcome him to the stage.
Oh wow, this is exciting, isn't it? Thank you, Peter and Janina, for those kind words. I'm really delighted that you've joined us for this inaugural Wheelton Family Inspiring Social Change lecture, which we hope will be an ongoing conversation that can happen each year. I particularly thank the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation for their vision and risk-taking in pursuing this thing and in including me and my family in this endeavour. The series hopes to harness the power of conversation and connect people and organisations to create momentum for positive change in addressing the most pressing issues in our economy and community. As Janina mentioned, my philanthropy started with the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation nearly 20 years ago. I started with a small fund with $5,000 and we've been able to grow that over time. The intention is that we leave a lasting legacy for future generations, and I'm so proud that all my family is here to take that. There will be a large distribution each year that they will decide on which charities that they want to be involved in. So it's really pleasing to see that. And I would encourage all of you who don't have something with LMCF in a charitable fund to think about it, and the younger you are the better because it'll grow quicker. But you can start one with a few $1,000s, and as I said, I started small and you grow with it, and with the aid of the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, the guidance they give you is outstanding, and that's really enabled us to take great steps forward. So, as I said, supporting the Foundation is one of the most effective ways we can inspire positive change in Greater Melbourne and beyond. I've seen firsthand how philanthropy can support people, ideas, organisations and systems that can shift the status quo and help reshape systems that are too often leave people behind. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Katherine Trebeck as our very first family lecture keynote speaker. The wellbeing economy movement is beginning to gain momentum here and overseas, and what we hope is that Melbourne can take the lead in this in Australia. Thank you for joining us tonight. I encourage you to get involved and be part of this change. I look forward to great things actually happening out of this lecture. So thank you very much. And welcome, Dr. Katherine.
Wow. Hi, everyone. This is very, very special to me, for me to be here. I want to say particularly a huge thanks to Paul and your beautiful family who I've had the honour of meeting this evening. It's just a real treat, actually, to have this space and to bring together friends and family and colleagues to think more deeply about social change. And also huge thanks to Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation also for inviting me. Suze, particularly, you've been incredible, taking care of all the arrangements, but to Peter and Stephen and the team, it's a real delight to work with you. And I also want to say my aunt and cousin, Kerry and Andrew, are here, so it's very special for me as well to have family here, and even some of my friends from my school days But I also am a big believer in the phrase that strangers are just friends you haven't met yet. So thank you, friends, for coming along this evening to join us. I have been told to push the envelope and to challenge you, so here goes. I also, of course, it is Reconciliation Week, and I want to say that I'm so grateful. I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, as you can get a glimpse of it if I get myself off screen. Go back. Beautiful, beautiful Canberra, and really appreciate just how generous First Nations communities are to those of us who need to understand and learn so much more from them about how to take care of our land and our futures. So I want to start with one of my favourite phrases, that a revolutionary moment in the world's history is a time for revolutions, not for patching. And these words were written by William Beveridge in the midst of the Second World War, in the document that laid the foundations for the UK's NHS and its social security system. And I think it's quite remarkable that in the midst of the Second World War, with all the destruction and sense of hopelessness, that Beveridge could imagine something profoundly better. A suite of institutions based on solidarity and not selfishness, something to build for the long term. And so that is our task today, to really think, how can we go beyond just patching up this current system, but think about what are the revolutions we need to create for our future. Stephen, wherever he is, at Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, came up with the title of this talk, Beyond Tweaks, Confronting the Economic Elephants in the Room. And then I stumbled across this cartoon. So these elephants here are going to be our waymarkers for the conversation tonight. And I could have written 6 lectures on this topic. I could have written many longer lectures. There are so many dimensions, tensions to pull apart, issues to dive into. But I've got limited time, so I'm going to focus on a couple of things. Firstly, why we need a wellbeing economy, how we have got so stuck where we are today, what is a wellbeing economy, and how we might just go about building it. So to start there, why do we need a wellbeing economy? Now, it's quite usual for me to begin talks like this, laying out the extent of environmental breakdown, the extent of inequality and poverty and alienation that undermine our communities. But I'm going to run with what might be an unfounded assumption that those of you here get that you understand some of the contours of what the World Economic Forum calls the poly crisis. And instead, I want to take the time to just open up some boxes behind the economy and its impact that are not often opened up. Because as a manager of a brilliant cafe in Canberra, a place called Gang Gang Cafe, and if you're next in Canberra, you must go there, Jamie runs this cafe, and he said the other day, we can't say, she'll be right, mate, if we don't know how broken things are. So I want to dig into some of the reasons why things are so profoundly broken in society, and we can't just write them off by saying, she'll be right, mate. And first of all, one of the big elephants in the room is that Australia's huge economic wealth stands on the basis of stolen land and unpaid rent to First Nations communities. And this is a question that is rarely talked about, even in Reconciliation Week. So I want to name that up front of one of the big economic elephants in the room. But we also need to look at the extent to which, whereas pre-distribution used to work for Australia, used to be the case that if you worked, you could build a decent livelihood for yourself and your family if you're a white, able male. But what's happened is we've become an assetized economy. An economy where your access and your ownership of assets determines so often your life chances and the choices you're able to make. And if, like this couple depicted in the little cheeky image from Double Bay today, if you don't inherit or you don't otherwise acquire some of those assets, you are going to have to moderate your choices. So we might not be an aristocracy in Australia, but we certainly are an assetocracy. And what's happened is people are pushed into seeking unearned income because even the social wage that we used to be able to rely on, health and education, even shelter, that's been residualised, fiercely means-tested, and eaten away at the core. And so folks can no longer rely on government, and they can no longer rely on their wages, and so they're driven to focus on earning what's called passive income, unearned wealth. And so we need to confront that, because these are decisions made by governments around how we tax capital, how we tax unearned wealth, how we tax income that give rise to an assetocracy. But not only does the way the economy is set up limit your life choices, it profoundly impacts your life chances. Now, this is work done in the States by Anne Case and her Scottish and Nobel Prize-winning husband, Angus Deaton, who incidentally just recently posted on the IMF a retraction of his career-long adherence to economic orthodoxy. And what Anne Case and Angus Deaton did is they looked across these premature mortality, the rise in deaths by drug overdoses amongst white, sort of low-educated men in the US. And they said, what is happening there? And they described them as the deaths of despair that have risen by 400% in recent decades. And they say what is happening here is that this is a group who the economy used to work for. This is a cohort that would have benefited from what's been described as the golden age of capitalism, that post-war era. And now this is a cohort that is facing unemployment, insecure, ununionised, precarious work. And their social support systems are being undermined, and they are turning to coping mechanisms in drugs and alcohol, and it is costing them their lives. But here too in Australia, people who are working on the issues are recognising the economic causes of despair and distress. Now, this is the recently published National Suicide Prevention Strategy, and it sets out the social, and for that read economic, determinants of suicide. Things like quality wages, the conditions at work, your income adequacy, your housing conditions, and so on. Quite literally, is the economy working for you or not, is one of the factors driving suicide in Australia. And of course, it's on the environmental side as well. And you're probably very familiar with the image at the top half of this screen, the levels of global warming since 1970. But when we marry that with biodiversity loss on the bottom half of the screen, you see that not only are we in a hotter world, but we're in a greyer world. So we're facing global warming and profound loss of biodiversity. And the two are linked. The social injustices that we see, the ascetisation, the rising levels of inequality are profoundly linked to the environmental crises. The two are the different sides of the same coin. And coin is apt because it is a way we design the economy that links the two. Now, this is research done by former colleagues of mine at Oxfam, and they looked across the world, looked at people and ranked them by income deciles and looked at their consumption-based CO2 emissions. So they're looking at who is putting most pressure on the planet. And what it reveals is that the richest 10% of people in the world by consumption-based emissions are those who are emitting more than half of the world's CO2 emissions. So anytime someone says to you, we are putting more pressure on the planet, or humanity is pushing Mother Nature beyond what she can handle, show them this slide. Now, ironically, it becomes one of those 1950s champagne glasses. But the other side, of course, of this chart, it is those at the bottom, the poorest 50% of the world's population, of course, who are most harmed, who has least resources to be able to buffer against the impact of environmental breakdown. So you have to remember that inequality inherent in environmental crises. And part of what's going on is that we have a distorted sense of value. So many of the choices taken in our economy turn a blind eye to the impact on the environment. They quite literally externalise the environment as if it no longer matters. Now, Paul and I share a love of Scotland. This was an ad in the Scotsman newspaper a couple of months ago, and it's basically saying that it is cheaper to fly from Edinburgh down to London than it would be to get the train from Edinburgh across to Glasgow. Now, this is profoundly perverse, because Glasgow is a much better city than London, so I don't know why you would want to spend your time flying down to London when you could jump on the train and go to Glasgow. But it's also perverse, of course, because the pound sign that people see on their airline ticket does not take into account the environmental impact of that flight. And of course, companies like this are part of the business community. And in fact, the business community is one of my least favourite phrases, because it implies that wrapped up in the business community is this unified, homogenised bunch of actors that all think the same and all act the same. And yet some businesses are profoundly extractive and some are constructive and contribute. Some prey on society and the environment, and others very deliberately and concertedly contribute to it. And nowhere do you see this most acutely than in time of crisis. And a couple of months ago, I was back in the UK, and Heathrow Airport shut down. I don't know if it made the news here. And what did hotels around the Heathrow Airport perimeter do when people were stranded, had nowhere to go, didn't know when they were going to be able to get home? You know what hotels did? They jacked up their prices. They quite literally tried to cash in on the crisis that was facing so many people who were stranded at Heathrow Airport those days. That was one response to the crisis. Another response is seen when COVID hit, and many, many businesses said, how can we help? How can we be part of contributing to the response to this crisis? And again, beautifully embodied by the example of Scottish whisky distillers who said, you know what, we can make alcohol. So they turned their whisky stills into making alcoholic hand gel that they rushed out to get to the NHS when they needed it both. So we've got to distinguish and unpack who it is in the business community that we want to celebrate and listen to. And I want to finally introduce you to a concept that if you haven't heard of before, you'll probably have almost definitely encountered. This is one of my favourite economists. This is the late Manfred Max Neef. He's from Chile. And he talks about fundamental human needs. He says we all need subsistence. We all need enough shelter and food to survive, but we also need a sense of protection. We need a sense of safety. We need a sense of autonomy. We need freedom of choices and identity. We need connection with families and friends. We need a sense of voice. And his laying out of fundamental human needs resonates with groups like Australia Remade, who talk about care, contribution, and connection, or the psychologists Deci and Ryan, who talk about those fundamental human needs of autonomy, relatedness, and competence. But Manfred Max Neef also warns of what he calls pseudo-satisfiers. So think robot friends for affection. Think reaching for consumerist goods for a sense of belonging and esteem. Think well-stocked, very fancy kitchens for a sense of security. Think Amazon and huge shopping malls for a sense of freedom. So I want to, having talked to you about the what, I want to dig in a little bit to the why. How have we got stuck there in this sort of economy? I want to take stock of why we are where we are, what locks in our imaginations. And I want to just pause and say, when I talk about the economy, I'm really leaning on its original Greek word of oikos, which means household management. But I'm expanding the idea of the household to wider society, even our planet, even generations into the future. And so if you take that idea of household management, the economy becomes a provisioning system. It's how we create, how we distribute, how we take care of each other, what we build together and what we share. And we can make it, we can influence it to different degrees, we can design it differently to the way it's operating today. We can break it out of being an economy that is overly assetized, that hasn't paid its rent, that doesn't distinguish between different parts of the business community, and that contributes and relies on pseudo-satisfiers. Now, this is the other elephant that I want to introduce you to. On Boxing Day, because this is the sort of thing I do on a public holiday, I was reflecting that how since moving back to Australia a couple of years ago, I've been really struck by how there's a paradox at the heart of so much policy making in Australia. And so for the first and only time in my life, I found an AI image generator. And I typed into that AI image generator the words, "putting our eggs all in one basket while dancing around the elephant in the room." And this is the image that came out of it. Let me explain it to you, because it's a bit awkward. But essentially, there's a whole lot of economic thinking that relies on just pedaling and pushing down on the accelerator of more and more of the same. Rolling out the same recipes, focus on the economy, and she'll be right, mate, seems to be the mantra. This is putting our eggs all in one basket, assuming that if we reach for those same old recipes, things might just be different, and ignoring the damage that that is doing to the planet or to people. And here is depicted the Black Summer bushfires by the cartoonist Polly Farmer. But of course, we could replace that image with the floods of this week, or the droughts in South Australia, or Cyclone Alfred, or just any of the constant examples of how Mother Nature in Australia is being pushed beyond breaking point. So that's putting all our eggs in one basket. And then the other point is around so many people working on the collateral damage of that approach. Recognise the economy as a root cause of so many of the challenges facing the communities that they work with. And yet so often what is on the table is only focusing on the individual, staying downstream. Now, this is research generated a few years ago by a bunch of actuaries, and they compared the top 20% by income in society in Australia with the bottom 20%. And it reveals that those in the bottom 20% more likely to die young, more likely to be a victim of violent crime, more likely to commit suicide, more likely to have poorer health. The economy is not working for these communities. And yet, what is on the table is so often focused on the individual, putting all the onus of change on the individual, telling the individual that that's where responsibility for transformation lies, rather than looking upstream at the contours of the economy and taking action there, despite the fact we know how important the economic system is in shaping people's life choices and their life chances. And so what happens if you're attentive to these challenges? It so often feels overwhelming. And what happens when we feel overwhelmed? We think fast. And we often reach for things we have done before. We reach for things that we've tried and rolled out before, whether they're fit for purpose or not. And so the economic change movement, the progressive movement more broadly, is great at creating toolkits and indices. They're great at hosting summits, great at doing that insider lobbying where they're talking to politicians, and when politicians say, what's the one thing I can do? We'll put one thing in front of them as if it was that simple. But the problem is that reaching for those same recipes, just saying have more of the same, doing what we've done before, because that is simpler, means we stay downstream. Calmer waters, yes, maybe, because upstream it is choppy and disruptive. But downstream also means we risk being stuck with system-compliant fixes, responding to the collateral damage of today's system, but not acting on the root causes. A fix here, a patch there, a tweak here, but not confronting the economic elephants in the room. And it is hard to break out of that conformity, of that circular thinking. It is hard to really think boldly because it's dangerous and there's choppy waters upstream. And often the way so many of the institutions in which change agents work in, they almost create a sense of unsafety Think of the media gotcha moments for politicians, the way so many people work in systems where their individual promotion is based on proven successful innovation, which has an inherent bias towards the status quo. The Senate estimates committees, which constrain public servants by being bold and creative. Oppositional politics, which locks us into what we've done before. Quarterly reporting and remuneration for CEOs based on share prices. And short-term impact reporting when we need siloed thinking. All of that locks us in to business as usual, to system-compliant fixes, not to radical incrementalism, which would building for change, even by small steps, but with keeping our eyes on the upstream changes that are needed. I bet you didn't think you'd see him today. In 1983, Ronald Reagan said, "There are no limits to growth, because there are no limits to human imagination and wonder." But I often think now it is our limited collective imaginations that stop us imagining a different, bolder economic system that is changed upstream. It locks us in to the current way of doing things and just offering more of the same, as if that will do the solution, as if that will do the job. We're stuck with system-compliant fixes. And there's some mantras that are repeated in economic policy conversations in Australia, almost like incantations that we repeat like shibboleths, and they almost become spells that lock us into a business-as-usual trance. So things like, if we just have more productivity, that will automatically lead to better living standards for everyone. But no one is asking, what about distribution? What about power imbalances within firms? What about having a question and a conversation about what do we actually want more of, rather than just trying to be better at creating more and more? We're often told there is no magic money tree, except there is. When COVID hit, or when defence industries call, or even we could flip the conversation and say how much money is being spent downstream dealing with the avoidable costs of the current system in what's increasingly being referred to as failure demand. So many of our budget items in government budget statements are downstream, fixing, repairing, healing after the fact. We also see the fetishization of being fiscally responsible and actually being environmentally responsible mocked and dismissed. And you don't need to look far for an example of that, because in the last 24 hours, we had the minister, who ironically used to be the Minister for Emergency Services, on the weeks that huge numbers of families across New South Wales have been flooded out of their homes. The same minister is opening fossil gas for another 50, 40 or so years. And even people who could be part of building a different economic system, who have access to government officials, who have the time to research and build the evidence and distill ideas down, are content to offer up system-compliant fixes because it's easier and their status and their influence and their access depends on it. And so I've been starting to think that maybe Upton Sinclair was right when he says that it's very difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it. And so again, we have lock-in of business as usual and system-compliant fixes. So I want to briefly turn to what a wellbeing economy is. How could things be better? Rather than just doing more of the same better, how can we imagine things actually being better by taking action upstream? And so this is where the idea of the wellbeing economy comes in. And I'm not actually going to dwell on the idea of a wellbeing economy other than to really share with you, at its most basic, it is about deliberately designing and purposing the economy so that it meets the needs of people and planet. It has at its heart a very different logic from the economy of today. It is driven by the logic of collective well-being for people and planet, quality of life for everyone now and into the future. That's how it's designed, and that's how its success should be measured and assessed. And there are loads and loads of different changes that are needed to get there. And those of you who've probably heard this before, this sort of talk from me before, will hear about the 4 Ps. There's this huge jigsaw puzzle of changes that are necessary, from the very local right up to the supranational. But if you imagine it like a jigsaw puzzle, it reminds us that not one of those pieces is sufficient on their own. We need people working on all sorts of pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. But to get your head around it, we can grapple with it by clustering them into these 4 Ps of purpose, prevention, pre-distribution, and people-powered. And so purpose is about understanding the economy not as an ends in itself, but as a means to get there, a provisioning system, to go back to that original Greek meaning of the word, a mechanism to deliver social justice on a healthy planet, to take care of future generations, to enable people to thrive within planetary boundaries. And so that means being very fussy about what we grow, not just focusing carte blanche on more and more growth for its own sake, by saying, what is it we need to nurture? Differentiating within the business community, thinking about what sort of actors do we need to make up our economic ecosystem. Prevention is about saying we have to do better than just spending so much money downstream after the fact, healing, fixing, repairing after the damage has been done. Now, in the short term, of course, that is utterly critical because it's about helping people and planets survive and cope with today and tomorrow. But we cannot stay stuck there. So prevention is about daring to ask why and why and why until you find the root causes and taking action there. Pre-distribution is about saying, how can we get the market economy to do much more of the heavy lifting in delivering the sort of balance of resources that we need to see in society, rather than just turning to government after the fact and getting them to redistribute through taxes and transfers. So essentially things like worker-owner cooperatives, community wealth building, and true cost accounting, where we don't externalise those prices, but using the market to be part of the contribution to the common good. And then finally, people-powered. This is about making sure people are at the forefront of economic change, making sure that they feel in the driving seat, that they feel that the economy is for them and about them. So things like participatory democracy, things like economic democracy and a real just transition. They're the sorts of pieces you'll see. And I could go on and give you a ton of examples. Warwick Smith and I published a paper last year that sets out some of these things, and I'm about to publish another paper for The Next Economy with a load of illustrations that show there are plenty of things happening in practice and in the corridors of governments around the world and here in Australia. There is no shortage of illustrations that show what this looks like. But it's a little bit like my nephew's bedroom floor, where we've got tons of pieces of the Lego laid out. So we've got loads of practices, loads of good policies out there that have the potential to contribute to building a wellbeing economy, but they are not yet adding up to the change needed. And that's because while we've got practices and while we've got policies, we haven't changed our mindsets. We are still looking for simply system-compliant fixes. We are staying downstream. We're not asking the why. And so we are just patching and repairing and tweaking the damage that has been done. So I want to finish by thinking, how can we go about building a wellbeing economy? How can we get there? And it's going to require that we build a massive movement. But before we do that, rather than rushing to what we've already known and reaching in our back pocket for recipes that we've tried before and tactics and approaches that are easy to roll out because they're just what we used to do, that's what we've always done, I think we should heed the beautiful words of the Nigerian poet Bayo Akomolafe. He says, "The times are urgent, so slow down. Slow down to pause and rethink our tactics, to rethink who is not part of this conversation, to think, are we going upstream enough, or are we just being content to implicitly patch up the current system? How do we go upstream? How do we build a wider movement? How do we dare to ask different questions? How do we expand our imagination so we can imagine an economy that is better than the one we have today?" So how things are discussed really, really matters, because it changes who is part of the conversation. And if we lead with language that is divisive and that makes people feel ashamed, we will shut down the conversation. So we need welcoming and inclusive language. We need to broaden the conversation, to reach out to folks who are struggling to get by today, who are struggling to get to the end of the month, and work with them to understand why their challenges have their economic roots in the economic system of today, and together build ideas of a different economic system. And we need to work with people to change how they feel, so they feel excited and energetic about this. And on Paul's business website is a beautiful phrase that renters and staff will remember how you made them feel, so make them feel welcome. And I think that is utterly critical for the economic change movement today. We cannot keep being stuck in just talking to each other, coming up with new reports and new papers and great websites. We need to expand the movement. So we need to change how we talk about this to broaden the conversation and open up imaginations about what's possible. And so let me give you an example of that. A couple of weeks ago, I was sitting in the National Library listening to a lecture from someone, I won't name him, but I think we can describe him as one of the silverbacks of economic policy in Australia. And he said, well, of course we just need to grow the pie bigger because otherwise we are just squabbling over the slices. But what if he had said, well, maybe we don't need to grow the pie because we've got enough, and maybe we can have a conversation about sharing better. But he used the word squabbling. I want to use the word sharing. How we change, how we talk about things can shift the conversation in the way we need to do to think more expansively and think upstream. This is a pretty normal, pretty average cafe on the Isle of Bute in Scotland. It gets reviews on TripAdvisor along the lines of really friendly staff, love the fish and chips, pizza is great value for money. But Bute is special. 15 years ago, this tiny island of Bute welcomed over 100 Syrian refugees. But before the refugees arrived, the local government and local support agencies took the time to work with people on Bute to explain what their new neighbours had been through and what some of their challenges will be. And it has been an incredible story of welcome and homecoming, including for the owner of this Bonnie Clyde cafe, who now proudly has a Syrian chef. And so now the reviews on TripAdvisor are things like, I love the halloumi and za'atar wrap. I thought the hummus and the baba ganoush was fantastic, and a little Syrian treat on the Clyde. And this is a tiny and perhaps all too rare story of taking the time to support people in the process of change. But it reminds us that the idea of compassion as a methodology for system change has been something that's been way too absent from our toolkits up till now. And compassion is not just a sort of sympathetic tilt of the head. Monica Warling from Stanford University says there are 4 stages of compassion. Yes, there's noticing pain and suffering. And yes, there's feeling that empathetic concern and sadness. But it's also about interpreting the suffering and taking action to alleviate it. So it is about understanding and asking why and why and why. So you go upstream rather than just putting a few coins in someone's cup, but you take the time to understand, to do what Bayo Akumalafe says, slow down and look upstream to the causes. And so it's about not just feeling with our hearts, but using our brain to understand and analyse and understand those root causes. And that's where the wellbeing economy unashamedly comes in. And so finally, the way we're going to go about building this economic system is not having single individual heroes, but actually have a mosaic of the movement. We need people working deep within the heart of the current system, and I call them many allies, and some of you are probably in the room, policy entrepreneurs who are inside government, inside institutions, changing from the inside. We need people who are agitating from the outside. We need people who are translating the two together. We need people who are calling out the current system. We need people who are helping power down those aspects that are currently so unaligned with the needs of people and planet. And the problem is so often the movement turns on itself, bit of friendly fire, bit of splintering, a bit of saying, my hammer is the only hammer we need to use. And so what happens is that leads to splintering and fracturing. But we need to embrace the beauty of a mosaic system and be inspired by this Maori phrase, and I'm not going to try and pronounce it in Maori, but it means if everyone plays their part, the job will be done. And that's the task of the economic change movement, is to figure out what your part on this journey is. Where do you sit in holding up the ambition, holding up the attention to upstream change? Where do you sit in building the wellbeing economy? Is it rolling up your sleeves in doing it? Is it supporting those incredible parts of the business community that are aligned with economic change? Is it building the evidence base? Is it going into governments and working with decision makers and saying, here's how things could be different and here's what's happening around the world? I want to finish by sharing with you a phrase that helps me keep going when I feel overwhelmed, when I tend back to reach for what I've normally known. Because while it's usual at the end of a lecture like this to give a call to action or a call to arms, I can't do that. I can't offer you one single simple thing to do, because there is no simple flick of a light switch. There is no one task that can be done. We need everyone doing their part so the job will be done. But what I can do is share with you these beautiful words of wisdom that says, can we rely that we will make enough change to save the modern world? And the quote went on, it said, well, if we think yes to that answer, to that question, then we'll just become complacent. And then they said, well, but also, if we say no to that, that will lead to despair. And so this quote went on and said, well, do you know what? The thing is to just leave those perplexities behind and just get down to work. Just start being part of that economic system change. That was Schumacher writing in the 70s. I'm going to stop there because we're going to have a conversation. But thank you so much, and I'm excited to hear about where you fit in the economic change movement.
Hello. Well, thank you very much for that terrific lecture, Katherine. That was fantastic. My name is Misha Ketchell. I'm the editor of The Conversation. My job, I've been told, is to make sure I don't hog all the questions. So what I'm going to do is just ask a few questions to start us off. I've got some questions that were submitted by audience members before we met tonight, which I'm going to draw on a few of those. And then I'm going to go to the floor and ask everybody out there to be part of this discussion, because it seems to me that this is the sort of big idea that actually needs a real sort of meaningful engagement actually in the room itself. But before I start going to all the questions I've written down as part of while I was listening to your lecture, I was asking you in the green room before how you got into this whole area of the wellbeing economy, and I'm really keen to hear about how you sort of came to this set of ideas.
Yeah, it's a lovely question, because it makes me sort of think, were there any key moments or catalytic sort of revelations? And there are a couple. One was in my sort of early 20s. I was studying at Melbourne University, and I was restless, and so I went to Scotland, a place I've fallen deeply in love with. But on the way back, instead of just coming back or doing a bit more travel, I spent some time working in Cameroon, and I don't think I was particularly useful, but I made some really beautiful friends there. And when I got back to Melbourne and picked up my studies, I got word where the village that I'd been working had been decimated by a flood. And so my instinct was to just rush back, go back there and help, because these were, friends of mine who were suffering. And luckily, I happened to be chatting to someone who was one of my tutors at the time, and she was probably only a few years older than me. She was an activist from East Timor. Her husband was in jail, incredibly inspiring woman. And I was telling, I don't know how we come to be talking about this, but I was telling her about this. I said, I've just got to get back. And she just said, don't be so stupid. I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, you're this young white girl. You'll just get in the way. And I said, well, yeah, but my friends, I just want to go and fill sandbags or peel potatoes. And she said, listen, you're at this amazing university. You've got all this privilege. Do what you can to get all the education you can to work on why that village and those like it were vulnerable. And so that conversation was a pivotal moment for me. It shifted. I had been really interested in trade and community development, and it just shifted my gaze to thinking about what are the systemic causes of vulnerability, like the village that had hit the village I'd been working in. And then a few years later, I moved to Scotland. I moved to Glasgow. Nothing career-orientated, just because I've fallen in love with Scotland. And when I got there, I saw this sort of stylisation of the Glasgow train map, and it was led by some public health experts, and it showed that from the train station near where I used to live, now I'm Canberran, so I have a very low commuting threshold, and I moved in to the right near the Glasgow University where I was first working. So I was living in the west end of Glasgow. But this stylised train map showed that for every train stop that you travelled from west to east across Glasgow, and if any of you have been to Glasgow, you'll know it's not a huge town, life expectancy for men fell by 2 years for every train stop. And there was a difference in life expectancy from where I was living to just the other side of the city of 14 years. And it got worse the further east you go. And then I started working with Oxfam. And just as I started working with Oxfam, the Haiti earthquake hit. And in Haiti at the time, which a lot of folks will know is a pretty failed state, the life expectancy in Haiti was 64. In parts of Glasgow, life expectancy is 54. And so I just started asking these questions around what is it about the nature of this economic system that is quite literally a matter of life and death? Who is winning and who's losing out of the economy, and how decisions about distribution, what we make, quality of jobs, how people are treated, this idea of consumer citizen that's really profound in Glasgow, that matters very literally to people's life chances. And so I kept asking questions about the role of GDP and how we produce and consume, and just, kept going.
Actually, it's interesting that you mentioned GDP, because one thing as you were talking I was thinking about was you seem to be arguing that we're stuck in a certain kind of system and we can't move on from it. I think one of the things that maintains an existing system is the measurement tool. So the existing system has got GDP. Mm-hmm. What would a wellbeing economy have, and how can it disrupt that?
That's a great question around what would be a better measure of progress. And there are a load of different indices out there. There's a Human Development Index, there's the OECD's Better Life Index, there's a ton of different examples. I don't know if anyone noticed the final slide I showed where I had the words "thank you." It was a picture of girls riding their bikes. And I just have this little dream that maybe, thank you. Instead of having the Mayor of Melbourne saying under the Mayor's watch, regional gross value added will go up, maybe things like the number of girls who ride their bikes to school will go up. And I call these cornerstone indicators. And it's essentially, could we imagine measures that make intuitive sense to a community? And I haven't tested this one, so I don't know if it's the right one, but I have a hunch people might like it. And you think about it, if the number of girls riding their bikes to school is going up, what else is in place? Parents can afford bicycles. So there's a measure of financial sufficiency there. They're able to afford breakfasts for their daughters. The streets are sufficiently safe. There's a measure of sort of local provision of services because the schools are nearby. And so, maybe it's not that one, but I think we need measures that make intuitive sense to people, because there are a ton of different measures out there. The challenge is they're just not being used to reshape policy and government to the extent that GDP is used as that lens. So often GDP is the lens that's run across policy ideas. Will this increase GDP? And yet there are huge perverse incentives bound up in GDP. And I was saying to some friends, Bill and Ali, last week, GDP hero is a chain-smoking terminal cancer patient who's going through an expensive divorce, who crashes his car on the way to his job as an arms dealer because he's texting while eating a takeaway hamburger. That's from Mark Anelski, who's a Canadian economist. And it just gives you a sense of all these things that are not really good for society, but are bound up in GDP. And I was talking about failure demand and spending on avoidable costs. Most of that spending is good for GDP. And yet, as one of my friends who's a cardiologist says, if she does her job better, GDP will go down.
So how do you get along with economists?
Most economists will recognise the flaws of GDP. most of them will understand and say, yeah, of course GDP is a flawed measure of progress. They'll probably say, well, it's the best we've got, so we have to run with it. But most of them will get it. And there's also, of course, I think economists get a bit of a bad rap because there's a whole wide range of economists out there. I think there's some who have pretty disproportionate access and influence on policy, but there's so many other economists out there. There's health economists, there's ecological economists, there's feminist economists, there's so many other approaches to thinking about how we do that provisioning that I was talking about. I think the task is really to sort of broaden the economic advice that is going into government, broaden the way we think about and discuss the economy, broaden the questions that governments are asked when they're talking about a new proposal. I mean, you heard I've mentioned the CEO of Woodside saying this Northwest Gas Shelf is going to be a powerhouse for the economy, but at what cost? And we don't often ask what cost enough.
Yet if I were to cast my eye across all of the sort of bodies who are providing key policy advice to government, so you think about the key think tanks, Grattan Institute, per capita, on the right, someone like the IPA, you think about bodies like the Productivity Commission. I can't think of one of them that would be putting forward ideas that would be consonant with what you're suggesting. All of them are working within a particular economic framework that would be involved with ideas about fixing the existing system. So if you're talking about a really meaningful systemic change, where's it going to come from?
It's going to come from people who are already rolling up their sleeves building it. There are so many examples of people who are creating enterprises that are not about short-term profit extraction, but are about contributing to communities, making things that are useful for society. There's a ton of people inside government who are already saying how to utilise policy instruments to encourage behaviours that we need more of. I mean, federal government, for example, is using the lever of procurement a lot more to bring about circularity and sustainability. There's the Indigenous procurement policy. And in Canberra, they have something great called Put Gender on the Tender. So all construction contracts have to speak to how the gender balance of their workforce. There's a ton of governments around the world who are starting to speak to a different vision of an economic system and put wellbeing at the heart of economic policy making. And Yanina mentioned the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership. None of them have all the answers, but they're saying, how do we learn from each other to start to bring these ideas into economic policy making? There's a ton of governments who are not using the word wellbeing or wellbeing economy, but are bringing in policies such as Sweden, who's got reduced VAT rate on repairing, or Oregon, who, if CEOs are paid over a certain percentage higher than the ratio of their pay to median income, they will be taxed punitively. There's the City of Toronto that's using procurement to bring about a more circular economy. There's Italy that for decades had something called the Marcona Law that's all about supporting worker-owned cooperatives. South Australia has just banned a whole lot of zero-waste plastics. In Canberra, they've banned public advertising. So you don't go around and see all this advertising to buy more and more and more, inspired by Sao Paulo. And what's interesting about that, and a ton of other examples I could give you, is it's not always about spending money. It's about saying, how do we bring to the fore a different sort of suite of activities? How do we redesign what makes up the economic ecosystem? And it's using regulation, it's using incentives, it's encouraging different behaviours. And yes, sometimes it will require spending money, but that's not the only solution.
What would you say is the biggest current barrier to sort of achieving this ignition of these ideas? I mean, you're talking about the fact there are lots of people out there doing it already and bringing those people together. But I do wonder how you scale that into a society-wide conversation that can have real political impact.
Yeah, and it is having political impact. So just 2 weeks ago, hundreds of people were gathered in Reykjavik in Iceland for the third of an annual Wellbeing Economy Governments Conference. You had governments from all over the world sharing their ideas of how to do this. If anyone has watched the former First Minister of Scotland's TED Talk, she pronounced the whole agenda of the wellbeing economy, so gave it huge political leadership. problem is, if you have narrow political leadership, it can be a blessing and a curse, right? Because so often political opponents, regardless of the merit of the idea, can attack your political champion just to nudge them off. And then when they leave, as politicians inevitably do, they often take the agenda with them. So there is a task to embed it more in the civil service, and that's what the Wellbeing Economy Governance piece is about, to embed it in the rules of the way budgets are designed, the way policies are evaluated, how long-term thinking is made. So it is about the machinery of government, but it's also about encouraging what's already going well. And I think there's a task for those of us in this room to point out what's great already, what's already aligned to this, but also call out that system-compliant thinking, that circular downstream system, and to dare to ask those questions, because I think all those organisations you rattled off, Misha, are probably playing with the art of the possible, but there is a task to move that, as you know, in the political science jargon, the Overton window, so that politicians don't have to be brave. I don't know, you're too young to know this, but some of you who are older, remember watching that film, that TV series, Yes Minister?
I do remember, and I love you calling me too young. I'm very happy about that.
So Yes Minister, right, was, its whole message is about a sort of blocking civil servants, Sir Humphrey, and this really hapless minister. And the subliminal message is that, one, government's problematic, but if Sir Humphrey ever wanted to stop the minister doing anything, he would say, "Oh, that's very brave, minister." And we need politicians who are ready to stare down that hysteria that will come from vested interests. We need them to feel they're on solid ground. And that's why, yes, that insider work is critical, but I think there is also a task to build a groundswell and momentum. And one of the things that keeps me hopeful is I'm a bit of a geek, and I look at a lot of opinion polling from Australia and around the world, and there is a ton of opinion polling showing that people are supportive of this agenda, supporting of its component parts. But that's clearly not enough, because it hasn't translated into that political will, and we have governments around the world taking pretty retrograde steps. And so I think the next task is to do, as I say, sort of build that, as I was saying, build that bigger movement so that politicians don't have to feel brave, because I don't think we have enough brave politicians. We need to make them feel pretty assured and on safe ground.
Okay, so last question from me. But because I work in the media, this is a topic that's really interesting to me, which is, it seems to me that the possibility for change, the Overton window that you're talking about, is dictated very much by the types of conversations you can have publicly, and they're dictated by the media. So you need a media that would be able to propagate and hold a conversation like this. I'm wondering where in the media, in the current media, that would or could happen.
Yeah, I think, you're right. The media does lock in this current system. I mean, the first question often the Treasurer will be asked on the day after Budget Day is, well, what's this going to do for our growth, Treasurer? Rather than how is this budget going to help people who are sleeping rough in our doorways, in our capital cities and under bridges and in our parks, and how is this budget going to support young people who are scared for their future and feeling lonely and isolated? We've got to ask different questions. How is the economy serving that? And not constantly repeat those incantations of orthodoxy and those mantras that lock us in to business as usual. There was a great instance in the UK where a bunch of folk challenged the BBC for constantly using that frame that the government is maxing out its credit card, because the government's not the same as a household. It can use its spending differently. And a bunch of folk really wrote to the BBC and hassled them and said, you can't keep repeating that. And so you get one of the greatest, writers in business in the BBC in the UK, Ian Verinder, who's saying we've got to think very differently about how we write about the economy and asking different questions. And so I think this idea of what's on the table when politicians are asked about what's success is really, really critical, and calling out that received wisdom. And one of the ones that bugs me the most is, well, we just increase productivity, that'll automatically link to increased living standards. No one interrogates that equal sign in the middle. No one says, okay, well, but what about distribution and the fact that we see so often the spoils going to those at the top? No one's questioning questions of balance of power within firms. just even asking that so there's a little bit more nuance and a bit of richer justification of those mantras, I think would really help.
Sounds like you should be talking to Danielle Wood, who's just about to do an inquiry into productivity in Australia. I'm going to open this up to the floor. Now, I've got some questions that were submitted beforehand as well, and I will try to intersperse some of those. But does anybody in the room have a burning question that they want to ask? Okay. We've got a few. Okay, so there's a lady over here, just over here.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Paul and Angela have been huge champions around supporting women and girls. So can you tell us a bit more about how a wellbeing economy might affect women and girls?
Yeah, so the current economy doesn't work particularly well for all too many women and girls. We see women are at higher risk of poverty, higher risk of having lower pensions in old age, lower superannuation. There's a lot of gender segregation, and often work that is dismissed as women's work is lower paid just because there's more women in that sector. And a wellbeing economy will have no chance of being achieved if it's not a gender equal economy, and if we don't have women at the forefront of businesses and designing the game. So gender equality is utterly critical, key part of a wellbeing economy, and all those different Ps have a role in speaking to gender equality, taking care of women and girls. And I'm very deliberate when I say, for this example of the number of girls riding their bikes to school, I think it's really important, and particularly on a global scale. Because if women are going to school and getting educated, they're going to have a chance to take care of their families, their villages, their cities, be political leaders. But also, it means that they're not being put out to work too early. They're not even being killed at birth, as we see in so many countries. And so putting women at the forefront is a really nice proxy for success as well.
So just before I go to the next one from the floor, Raina Fay has got a question, and she says, one of the elephants in the room is the distortionary effects of our tax system. What do you think are the priorities for revenue reform?
So I love tax, right? I have an accountant who doesn't quite understand when I keep saying, I'm fine, pay tax. I don't need to count that as a just deduction. Tax is really important. I think tax is sort of almost the price of citizenship. But I think there's almost three roles of tax that need to be embraced. So yes, it's revenue raising, but it's also about helping to sort of rebalance, and I talked about redistribution versus pre-distribution. I think tax does have a role in redistribution, but I think there's an element of tax that isn't on the table enough in these conversations around using tax as an instrument to encourage certain behaviours that we want more of, or discourage behaviours.
Economists would like you saying that. Incentives.
Yeah, absolutely. Use incentives. And so, for example, in Scotland, they have a pretty steeply increasing tax on second homes. The more expensive, the more value of the price of that second home, which is a good proxy for a wealth tax or a land value tax. Here we tax pretty heavily things like smoking, that when cigarettes, so we don't think these are good behaviour, but I don't think we utilise that mechanism enough. Say reducing taxes on, say, worker-owned cooperatives or community-owned cooperatives or businesses that are thinking more long-term. So I think there's a bigger conversation we could have about tax in Australia. It really makes me very sad that it seems the only conversation in Australia about tax is how to make reducing tax slightly more progressive, rather than saying how do we utilise tax as an important lever. I will say, I think though raising revenue is not the only question in reshaping this, and as I was saying earlier, that often it's not about spending. It's about using regulations. What do we encourage? What do we celebrate? It's not just about raising money and spending it. It's about saying, what do we need to make up our economic ecosystem?
I'm interested actually because you were talking in your lecture about the idea that so many policy reforms that are proposed are downstream from our problems. And I'm wondering whether you think those sorts of downstream reforms should be avoided entirely if they actually are a barrier to change, or whether it's sort of more substantive system change and some of those downstream changes.
Yeah, it's a good question, because I don't want to be disparaging of helping people survive and cope with today and tomorrow. As I said when I was talking about the 4 Ps, That's utterly critical given today's system. We can't walk away from suffering in the here and now. I just don't want to stay stuck there. Some measures that are ostensibly downstream, if they have their eyes set on contributing to bolder and broader system change, they're the right ones we need. And there's this phrase, radical incrementalism, that we can build by smaller steps if we have our eyes fixed on the changes we needed. The challenge is that so many of the apparent solutions that are offered are constrained by those narrow imaginations, by our sense that we can't dare to imagine something different. And so they are just tweaking the current system. They're just patching up and repairing the current way of doing things. And then they lock it in because they're not enabling and laying the path for something bigger and bolder.
Okay. There were more people who had questions, I think, over on this side somewhere.
Thank you, and thank you for the most wonderful presentation. You've talked about assetisation and unearned income as significant problems, and yet the retirement incomes policy here, which has been, I think, fantastic for the country, sees us, with everyone in this room, giving 10 or 15% of their income. And with now, we think, over 4 trillion in assets in one of the biggest retirement systems in the world. And that is all about assetisation and unearned income, and that's about providing for people's retirement. So there are some pretty fundamental challenges when you start attacking assetisation and unearned income, given what Australia's developed in that retirement income sector, which is trying to reduce the pressure on the federal government's budget. So thank you very much.
Might I just go back to that question though, because I think it is a good one, which is the thing about Australia's superannuation system and retirement savings and unearned income. Because a lot of people would say, we've worked through our whole lives, we've created these nest eggs, the idea of taxing them is traumatic to a lot of people. I mean, how do you deal with that if you're opposed to this idea of unearned income?
So everything in balance, right? So what I'm opposed to and what I'm dubious about is the extent to which that has become the only route for people to feel they can build the sort of life they want. Because people don't feel those collective institutions, and I think they're right in that feeling those collective institutions are no longer going to be there for them enough, because the state pension is pretty low. People can't access social housing anymore. Even health education system has been fiercely means tested and residualised and undercut, and so it's quite natural for people to reach for that privatisation of their own economic well-being. And the only mechanism for that is through creation of that unearned income. I think super is great. I think particularly if it can take a longer term view of what sort of businesses to invest in. And I work with a lot of folks in the financial services sector who, particularly in the UK, investors who are just tearing their hair out around quarterly reporting. And some of them are even starting to say we need to think beyond financial returns. We need to actually think in broader returns that deliver for society. I think super has the potential for that. Potentially if it can really align the needs of wider society with its investments. I don't think that's been tapped enough in Australia. I think it's a conversation we could have much more. But I think the question of how do we take care of people collectively rather than putting them into sort of individual boxes where they have to, the only option they have to have a decent life is through assets and growing those assets, so they're wanting to reach for that unearned income, that passive income, because it becomes quite a rational response to the way things are currently set up, I think is a question and a conversation we need to have urgently.
Okay, excellent.
Can I ask you, what's the tie you're wearing? What tartan? Good whiskey.
Look, unfortunately, I am getting the wind up. It is time. So I'd just like to once again thank Dr. Katherine Trebeck for a terrific lecture. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Misha.
Thank you so much, Katherine and Misha, for an incredibly thoughtful and also thought-provoking discussion this evening. We are almost at time, but if you can indulge me for a few more minutes. I just want to start with a couple of thank yous. A big thank you to Paul, your wife Angela, and your broader family for your long-standing support, your vision, and your encouragement to think boldly. And a big thank you to my colleagues, the team at Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation. Without them, this event wouldn't have been possible. Thank you. Now, tonight's presentation reminded me of that expression, if you don't change direction, you may end up where you're heading. Frankly speaking, that really scares me. So when promoting this event, I used the phrase, it's time for a new story. And I think Katherine has helped outline the urgent need for a new narrative, one for our times, and I guess the new framework for action. Recognising that the power of the status quo is considerable, the writer and journalist George Monbiot once wrote that you cannot take away someone's story without giving them a new story. It's not enough to challenge and discredit an old story, even if it's outdated. Change only happens when you replace it with another. And I think Katherine, once again, has made a compelling case for why we need to create a new story right now. It is overdue. And I'm very proud to say that the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation is embracing this sentiment. And we will continue to partner with Katherine and the Next Economy on creating momentum for this overdue change. I want to share another quote. The US social commentator Tom Atlee once described our world as getting better and better, worse and worse, faster and faster. I don't know if that resonates with you, but it certainly resonated with me. But it was the middle part of that comment that really resonated, because for too many, life isn't getting easier, and for many, it's getting worse. So we live in a time where we have access to more information almost than ever before, yet we're not necessarily better informed. We live in a time when so-called once-in-a-100-year climate-related events seem to be happening with increasing frequency and intensity. And we live in a time when the measures of success for our economy, our society, often run counter to so many of the things that we actually say that we value. So this evening also marks an exciting turning point in the history of the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation. For over 100 years, we have recognised the need to continually evolve, and so the foundation is changing again to ensure that we are aligning our efforts, our resources, and our support so that we can help create a better story for Greater Melbourne and its region, one with people and planet, social justice, and equity at the core. As a community foundation for Greater Melbourne, our new strategy, which can be downloaded through the various QR codes around this venue or our website, aims to support and mobilise us all to create a better story, one that learns from the past, grounds us in the present, but also guides us into the future. Whether that's being a much more effective vehicle for philanthropy, driven with humility, whether it's being a constructive agitator, supporting advocacy around fairness, livability and inclusion, or whether it's through a range of approaches and partnerships that we will engage with to support genuine community-led change. We will continue to evolve the way that we work with communities so that they can address their needs and they can remove the barriers to a just and equitable society. Finally, after tonight's event, we will share ways you can engage with us to help drive this positive change. We will share ways in which we can seek to reimagine what's possible, and we will share ways to build momentum for a wellbeing economy, one grounded in social justice, grounded in equity, and grounded in fairness. I'm so grateful for you all coming today. I have a sense that this conversation could have gone on for much, much longer, but I really appreciate you attending, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.